Well, welcome everyone to our learning session today. It's all about soybean cyst nematode for the next hour. We'll probably learn more about this than we ever thought possible from different regions of the country. But really, we're going to look at managing North America's top yield robber because it's getting tougher every year. And a lot of these producers here know that firsthand. They've been able to manage it, so we'll get some of that firsthand insight so that we can better manage it on farms at home as well. My name is Tyne Morgan. I host U.S. Farm Report. Very excited to MC this panel today. The Soybean Cyst Nematode Coalition, fairly new. I think it's the 1-year anniversary of the coalition. So a fairly new coalition for an issue that really has been an issue for several years, but a lot of producers just don't know it. So what are the key signs to look for? We'll get into that a little bit. But as I said, Tyne Morgan, host U.S. Farm Report, a weekend show. We actually did the entire show from Commodity Classic this week, and I would like to make my permanent residence Orlando because I feel like after this winter that never ends, I will never see the sunshine again. I mean, my gosh, I think we're getting 6 inches of snow again this weekend. But I host the show, and my husband works in agriculture. And the other day I asked him, I said, you know, in your wildest dreams, did you think we would be here? I mean, in your wildest dreams, did you think that you would be doing what you do and I would be doing what I love? In your wildest dreams, did you think that? And he said, well, I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. You were never in my wildest dreams. And I bet Greg's wildest dreams never contained soybean cyst nematode, right?
Well, not at first.
But now they've turned into nightmares,
yep,
right? It's
yep.
all the time. You think about soybean cyst nematode.
Right.
Well, I'll introduce the panel now. Like I said, a great group of guests. We have Greg Tylka from Iowa State University. These are the university folks first. Cathy Lawrence from Auburn University and Albert Tenuta with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture. And they're going to really discuss why soybean cyst nematode, or SCN, is becoming more challenging to manage every single year. And then we'll hear from farmers and get some firsthand perspective from them. Our farmers on the panel, we have Pat Duncanson from Mapleton, Minnesota, Ron Heck from Perry, Iowa, and Kip Roberson from Robertson, North Carolina. They really represent the various soybean production regions around the U.S. and will share, you know, really the tools and the management practices they use to successfully manage SCN populations in their fields. So, Greg or Albert, before we get started, either of you like to recognize any sponsors in the audience that you would like to acknowledge at this time?
Yeah, so we're all here on behalf of the SCN Coalition, which wouldn't exist without the soybean checkoff support from state checkoff boards, the North Central Soybean Research Program, and the United Soybean Board. But we also have wonderful industry partners, and our presence here, our participation in this year's Commodity Classic is fully funded by our industry partners. So we'd like to acknowledge Bayer, BASF, Syngenta, and Farm Journal. And I'm going to claim spotlight blindness. I can't really see who all's out in the audience, but do we have representatives from those organizations? If you would you please stand up? Okay. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. We wouldn't be here at the show without your financial support.
All right. And Albert, did he cover it?
Yes, he did.
Okay. You got it covered.
Thanks for checking on me.
No problem. Just, you never know. You are from Iowa State. Okay, so I'm just kidding. I'm a University of Missouri grad, so we've got to get this going, right? When you have different universities on the panel, you've got to throw it in there. Well, we want this to be interactive. So if you do have questions, don't forget you can raise your hand, ask those questions as they come to you. We'll have some time at the end, but like I said, we really want this to be interactive so you don't forget your question when it finally comes around. Feel free to raise your hand. We'll have a couple microphones floating around. But first, we want to start off with really an overview of the SCN problem with researchers, and I'm supposed to remind each of you researchers to keep your comments very brief.
Well, that's going to be hard for Greg then.
Very hard for Greg. He's used to filling an hour, but he's got to share the stage for an hour. So I just want you to remind you to keep it very brief. But we'll begin actually with Greg. You know, when you look at an overview of how the problem of soybean cyst nematode came about, it's been around for a long time, for many years, Greg. We haven't talked about it that much, in the past decade, but it's really been an issue. So when you look at SCN, the resistant varieties that were doing a good job, but now we're seeing populations on the rise. You know, explain why this is happening and really what you've learned recently with some of your research.
Well, a kind of a dirty little secret that I've been forced to admit is there was a time in the 90s when it was fairly easy to manage soybean cyst nematode for the short term. It simply involved take the test, beat the pest, which was the motto of the first SCN coalition. We work very hard with cooperating universities, cooperating state checkoff boards, et cetera, to really key in on helping farmers identify if they had SCN. And then it was as simple as growing a resistant soybean variety to kind of stop the bleeding of the yield in the short term. But a fatal flaw over multiple decades is that many or most farmers had to grow soybean varieties with the same set of resistance genes. And only those few early on who recognized the shortcoming of managing a pest with one set of resistance genes worked to broaden or diversify their management practices. So fast forward to the mid-2010s, and we now have, since I'm not allowed to use PowerPoint slides, I'm using this brochure. And if you open up your brochure, on the left panel, it shows you a map of the percentage of SCN fields in these various states that now have SCN populations with elevated reproduction on the common source of resistance. You'll notice that Iowa is missing in that map because I haven't done a survey, but we have done 25 or 30 years of field research funded by the Iowa Soybean Association, and in every field we do a research experiment in, we also measure how well PI 88788 controls the nematode. And that center graph, you'll see the little dots, which represent farmers' fields that we've worked in, how the dots are increasing at an alarming rate, showing that the nematode is adapting to or overcoming the resistance. And the final point of our situation is, since we did experiments in those fields, we have yield data, and the map on the rightmost panel shows the yield of resistant varieties that were grown in those experiments. And you can see that line, the slope of that downward pointing line isn't visually alarming, but there is a 14 bushel per acre difference between where the line touches the y-axis and where it ends. And so we are having farmers losing 10, 15, 20 bushels per acre while growing the 88788 resistant varieties. And I believe this situation that I just described is probably pretty typical for throughout the Midwest.
And you know, you talk about some of the yield issues that we're seeing with that, but Dr. Tylka, not everyone realizes that it is soybean cyst nematode causing some of that yield loss, right?
Correct. It doesn't cause the plants to become a special symptom or anything. The other thing is, we have to remember that if you're growing a crop and getting 55 or 57 bushels per acre, you might not be asking yourself what went wrong and not know that that yield should have been 62 or 63 bushels per acre. But that's our job as scientists, to collect scientific information through surveys and experiments and then convey that to the farming community to help convince them that this is a serious problem.
But if you're a grower in the Midwest right now, kind of what's your recommendation? What's your management recommendations as they head into the growing season?
So in the Midwest, there are, in my opinion, two types of farmers: those that are worried about SCN and those that should be worried about SCN. And so I'm not saying every farmer or every field has SCN, but every field in the Midwest in particular should be checked for SCN. And a test result of 0 is wonderful, but the absence of evidence doesn't mean there's evidence of absence. In other words, 0 tests can be false zeros, and so we encourage repeated sampling, maybe every 2 years, to keep an eye on what's going on in your fields, even if the results are 0.
And is there still time to do that now?
Depending on how late our spring arrives, in the Midwest in particular, once
Right.
the ground thaws and drains, soil samples can be collected and sent to a lab, and maybe point out to the lab that you really want the results pretty quickly.
All right, thank you, Dr. Tylka. I mean, we've been talking a lot about the Midwest and the issue in the Midwest, but SCN isn't just a Midwest issue. So next, we're going to have Dr. Cathy Lawrence. She's from more of the South region. Can you tell us a little bit about the nematode population in southern soybean growing regions and what you're currently seeing?
Okay, sure.
Oh, hang on, just...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, good. In our southern region, we have a diversity of nematodes. So typically in our crops, when we do our samples, reniform root knot, soybean cyst. We also usually have some lance, spiral lesion, and stubbly root. So in our more subtropical regions, we have more of a diversity out there in our samples. So typically, we're battling a multitude of different nematodes at one time.
So are you seeing a shift in some of these populations? I mean, when you look
Yes.
at, I mean, what are you seeing?
Well, typically in our area, you can tell me if we're right, we've been rotating more depending on crop commodity prices. So we have the luxury that they don't up north, that we can go to cotton, soybean, corn, and then put it in the wheat crop. So those are very common in our southern region. So every time you switch crops, you're going to switch which nematode prefers which crop. So we get more changes every year.
So it's not just soybean cyst nematode that you're battling.
No, we're
in the
watching
South.
all of them. Yes.
So do you feel like in the South, growers are aware of this issue? I mean, Dr. Tylka talked about it. A lot of times if you're getting, 50 plus bushel soybeans,
Right.
you think, oh, I don't have an issue, but it's actually there. So in the South, do you think growers are aware?
Some, but that's the same issue depending on, it doesn't matter what crop, it's that same problem. Once their yields start declining, they start looking for the problem. And our nematodes are microscopic, so you've got to run some kind of soil sample to find out if you have a problem, because your only great symptom you're going to have is a loss of yield with no explanation of why.
So when you look at some of the southern crops, different rotations, so can you talk about what rotations have been used and what's been successful in managing some of these SEN populations?
Cotton's not a host, so that's a great rotation if you have the equipment and the proper environment to where you can grow cotton. I know in North Carolina you can toward the coast, but not toward the mountains. So it depends on the heat that you have in the area, but cotton's an excellent crop. And peanuts as well. And so if we're very sandy, you can go to peanuts, and that's a great crop, but it depends on your farm and what you've got there.
So based on what you know today and all of your research, what are some recommendations that you have for growers in the South in managing these populations?
And the best thing is to know what are your nematodes and what are your populations. And as you go, rotate from field to field to change the crop in each field. And then we do have some resistant varieties out. And depending on our nematodes, so we're always depending on the nematode, looking for the resistant and then combining it with the nematicides that are out there. So we're usually looking at multiple management options to try to control it depending on the crop that you're growing.
And we know you can soil sample, but is there anything you can do mid-season to check and see if it's there?
Oh yeah, you can go out and take samples mid-season. That's usually the rescue when you see things aren't growing well.
And what can you do at that point?
We have some foliar sprays that you can put on some of our crops, not all of them.
And has that been successful?
Some growers like it, some don't.
Yeah. So do you feel like we're still learning with this?
Oh,
Do we have a
always.
lot to learn?
Always. It's always a changing environment that's going on in the crops and the commodities and new products and new varieties, so we're always learning something new.
All right, from the South, we'll go to the North. And Albert Tenuta, when you look at soybean cyst nematode populations in your area, what are you doing in newly emerging northern soybean growing areas? Because I know those are issues where SEN hasn't always been, and so something that growers haven't always looked for.
Yeah, no, so we've got differences depending on whether you're a historical area or a new area as well. So we've had soybean cyst nematode up through the north from Ontario, Wisconsin, Michigan into the Dakotas, Minnesota, and those areas since the mid-'80s, late '80s, and continued to today. And so we have those hot spots or those historical areas that have had a long history of soybean cyst nematode, but we've also been seeing these new areas where it's just been introduced in the past 5 or so years. So, depending on where you're at, the messaging can be different as well.
So, I mean, when you look at some of those northern growing areas, how long would you say that growers have been battling SEN there?
Yeah, like I mentioned, from an Ontario perspective,
Right.
in Michigan, Wisconsin, that late '80s, 1987,
Okay.
88, there was 4 or 5 states that all identified soybean cyst nematode around the same time. It had probably been there. In Ontario, we suspect over 20 years before that.
Really?
It goes back to what Greg was talking about, the hidden symptoms that sometimes you attribute your yield loss or injury in the fields to other common problems that could be occurring. And so it's a hidden yield loss in that. So it goes unnoticed in many cases. And that has been always a problem with soybean cyst nematode.
Yeah, and Dr. Lawrence talked about those shifts of nematode population. So is that something that you're seeing as well?
Oh, absolutely. It's similar for most of the north in those areas that have had the longest history of soybean cyst nematode. We are also seeing the adapted populations that are adapting to the main source of resistance, as Greg mentioned, the PI 88788, and that. So we're seeing those same challenges, in this year. And I see some of my Canadian colleagues there where we've been into fields with very effective SCN-resistant varieties, and this year we were seeing 30 to 40 to 50% yield loss due to soybean cyst nematode. And those are similar yield losses that I saw when I first started in 1981 when we had no resistant varieties. So even though we have effective resistant varieties, they've now become not as effective and almost are acting as a susceptible, which is really problematic.
So would you say overall, I mean, when you're talking about 50% yield loss, obviously you see there's an issue. Do you think most growers are aware that it's soybean cyst nematode, since it's something you can't visually see until almost it's too late?
Well, when you see 50% yield loss, you're pretty aware of it at that point. But it is and that's part of the whole reason for the SCN Coalition, is to increase that awareness. So growers that have had, it doesn't matter if you're in the north or in the south or in the Midwest and that have had a long history with soybean cyst nematode should be managing it and have been managing it with, through sampling, scouting, the use of resistant varieties rotations and that. And that's important. It's also important for those new areas where it's just starting to develop and the populations are low, by getting that message out there and getting growers to scout for it, find soybean cyst nematode while those populations are low, and so therefore we can prevent those significant yield losses from building those populations.
What are the signs of soybean cyst nematode, right? Because you can't always visually see it.
Yeah, in most cases, you go in, and Greg and Cathy would agree, and others, in that in many cases, growers already have an idea that something was going wrong in those areas of the field as well. There was, yield loss. You couldn't unaccounted yield loss. Not quite sure. You always hear herbicides, soil fertility, all these other compaction and other issues going in there. So you start seeing some unthriftiness of the field, some waviness in the field. Then you start seeing those stunted plants, the potassium type deficiency symptoms, those visual symptoms. And by the time you start seeing those visual symptoms, then you're losing 20 to 25% yield at that point. Right. But we want to stop that before we get to that point.
Right. So what are you talked a little bit about rotation. Is there any specific rotation that's worked in the north and really helped manage it?
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits for the northern producers is that we might have a bit more of a diversity in terms of crop rotations and crops used there. So for instance, for many of them, it'd be a corn, soybean, wheat type rotation. So you're adding that third crop, that cereal crop wheat in there. And if you get into the Dakotas, Minnesotas, and that, where you start bringing in and dry beans for us as well, and into the Dakotas and Minnesota as well, and then you got sunflower, canola, you've got some sugar beets. So you have more crops in there, and so now you can break that yearly, every other year soybeans to now every third or fourth year. That will help reduce both the selection pressure on the 88788, but also at the same time suppress the buildup of those populations.
And besides rotation, what other suggestions do you have for growers in the north?
Well, for sure. So always, whether you've had a long history of soybean cyst nematode or you're new to it, you got to get out there and sample. You see what's your number. One of the important parts of that is not only to know where you're at that point this year or whenever you take that soil sample, but it's also important to help you gauge your management as well. Are your numbers increasing? If they're increasing, that means that something's going on in that field, whether it's the new adapted population in that. If your numbers are staying stable or reducing, that means you're able to confirm your management practices if they're working well at that point as well.
Well, we talk about the issue, the potential yield loss, what you can do to manage it, but there are growers out there that are successfully managing soybean cyst nematode, and so we have three of those with us today to talk about that firsthand perspective and what they're doing on their own farm to keep those populations under control. We're going to start with Ron Heck from Iowa, because I know, Ron, you have an interesting story about discovering soybean cyst nematode back in the 90s, and then ever since then, you've been able to kind of keep that population in check. So talk about how you first discovered it, what were your steps, and then what you do today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't know I had nematodes, didn't know what they were, didn't know a thing about it. But in 1994, I got my first yield maps on my farm. And you all remember your moment when you saw your first yield map, and there's incredible variability there in yield, and I didn't know what to do about it. So I went to Iowa State and talked to the professors there, and they said, wow, that's really a lot of variability. It was new to them too. Went to the Iowa Soybean Association, where I was a director, and said, we need to learn how to handle this new tool. Farmers are going to be getting yield maps, want to know why their yields vary. We need to find out why. So we funded an agronomy project with Iowa State that happened to be on my farm. And we took soil samples. And much to our surprise, we found out that the largest cause of yield variability in my soybeans was soybean cyst nematode. We didn't even know we had them. So we called Greg and said, it's time to get you involved in the project here. It's not what we expected to find. We didn't see any sign of nematodes. They're not like weeds. You can't see them, but you have to manage them like weeds. I was having yield losses where I was getting 20 bushels an acre in spots that now I get 70 bushels an acre in those very same spots. I had nematode counts as high as 30,000. Once we found out that I had nematodes all over the place, we started looking around and found out they were all over Iowa. So I talked with Greg, what tools do we have? Not very many varieties back in 1995, but I started getting, I couldn't even buy all the nematode resistant seed that I wanted. It just wasn't available anywhere. But over the course of the last 20 years, I followed a rotation of PI 88, 788. I have soybean and corn rotation. So I'd have 3 cycles of different varieties of PI 88, 788, and then a Peking variety. And then I'd start the cycle again and do it again. Over the course of the 20 years, my nematode tests now come back very low to none at all. But as Greg said, just because you have a test that says you don't have them, you might have them somewhere else. Think of it as water hemp. Like if you could do a soil test for water hemp seeds and you might have the wrong spot in the field. If you're from the Midwest, you've got nematodes in your field and you're losing 2 bushels an acre or maybe 5 bushels an acre and you don't even know it, you can't see it. There is no way. You just simply have to take the test and quit blaming other things. I'm in the prairie pothole region. I thought it was iron deficiency chlorosis. I grew up with iron deficiency chlorosis. It's just something that you had in your bean fields. I don't have it anymore. It's gone. It never was iron deficiency chlorosis. It was always nematodes. Now, if you have some other areas in your fields that you think, oh, that's just sour dirt or whatever, that's a good place to look. But the nematodes can be managed. But like I say, you can't see them. They are costing all of us a lot of money. Even 2 bushels an acre is a lot of money over all of your acres. And I guarantee you, if you take steps to manage it, you will raise the poor yielding parts of your field. Mine went up 50 bushels an acre, but even if it's 5 bushels an acre, it's a really big deal. And the researchers are making me nervous. I hope the method I used still works. Because the nematodes are doing a better job of living on the PI 88, 788. But rotate resistance and take good care of your beans. Use seed treatments. In soybeans, stresses multiply. 1 + 1 = 3. Do everything you can to make your soybeans happy, and that'll help them fight off the nematodes. But really, you got them. You do have them, and they're costing you a lot of money.
You mentioned seed treatments briefly, but talk a little bit more about that. Seed treatments, cover crops, what are you doing other than just the rotation pattern that you've been in to help manage this?
I use the seed treatments to reduce the stress on the seed, and some of them have some activity on nematodes. But the most important thing is they keep your soybeans healthier. I'm also using some cover crops, and there are some reports that the cover crops help the vitality of your soil, the vitality of your soybeans, and may suppress nematodes. So that might be a really good answer for some of you in some situations. But it all goes back, keep your soybeans healthy. Don't let them get the flu. That's what nematodes are. They just have the flu. Keep them healthy.
So what's the one thing you want growers in the Midwest to know about soybean cyst nematode?
You have them. And you can't see them.
But just manage it. You can actively, you've been actively managing it since the 90s.
Yeah.
All right. Have you changed anything recently? You just stick with that pattern?
I'm not aware of anything else to do right now. So I'm pulling for the researchers to come up with something better. You wouldn't use the same herbicide year after year for 20 years, you know.
Right,
So,
right.
Yeah, that's the best we've got right now, is just rotate the sources of resistance.
And obviously it's worked. Yeah, from Iowa to Minnesota, Pat Duncanson in the Mapleton, Minnesota area. I mean, when did you first really notice that soybean cyst nematode was a problem on your farm, Pat?
Well, our story is very similar to Ron's story. There's a few variations, slight differences, but sometime in the mid to late 90s, we were encouraged to start taking soil tests through involvement in the Soybean Association, and we started taking some soil tests, and every field we tested had soybean cyst nematode. Our levels were quite low. We didn't have extremely high levels. We didn't feel we had visible yield loss symptoms. Our soybean yields weren't terrible. They were actually pretty good, and we were fairly happy with our soybean yields, but we were trying to keep them that way. So we began immediately, since we discovered we had them and kind of had the fear of God put in us, we started immediately planting beans, and at that time the only thing available was PI 88788, and aggressively immediately switched all of our soybean acres over and started planting them with the assumption based on soil testing that we had them in every field. And that actually cost us up front, because some of those initial varieties were not as robust. They didn't have as good of yield potential as the non-resistant beans. But that gap quickly narrowed, and for the last 15 to 20 years, we've had some really good soybean yields. We kind of forgot to test, and through the involvement in this panel last year, we tested every acre again last year, every acre this past year, just to get a new scoreboard and a report card. And those test results were very encouraging, and our numbers were actually lower and much lower than they were 20 years ago. So what we did from a management standpoint to get there, we did grow. Very few of our fields in the last 20 years have been a solid corn-soybean rotation. Through periods of high-priced corn, we had some extended corn rotations and fewer acres or fewer years of soybeans. We also had, in that 20 years of history, we had a period where we were able to incorporate a lot of processed or vegetable peas. And that other legume crop, which was harvested in a different cycle, seemed to have a big effect on the soil biology. And I think probably also may have had an impact on the soybean cyst nematode numbers. And more recently, in the last few years, as seed treatments have become available, we have aggressively started using seed treatments, trying to say, well, we need a multifaceted approach for soybean cyst nematode. We can't use PI 88788 anymore. I shouldn't say we can't use it. We can't use it alone. We need to use it in conjunction with other management tools. We have not been very aggressive in using the Peking resistance. However, I think that's really starting to change. And as I'm looking at seed availability for next year based on last year's results, I'm really encouraged to see some of the Peking varieties, and we are going to be planting quite a few acres to Peking resistant beans, so that every acre of soybeans that we planted in 18 got seed treatment on it to help as another source of resistance. Every acre we plant in 19 will either have Peking resistance or seed treatment on it. So the take-home message for me that I would like to send is do something more than you have been doing if all you're doing is using PI 88788.
Cover crops? Have you ever used that?
We're also experimenting with cover crops. I should say experimenting is probably, we're beyond that.
Past that?
We're past that experimental number, yeah. We're still trying to figure it out, and I probably will for the rest of my farming career. I'll be trying to figure out how to get cover crops. Last year we had a really tough harvest. It was really late. Yep. Cover crops in our northern zone, for us, especially with manure being a prime part of our nutrient system, and manure requires application, requires tillage. Typically, we're planting cover crops in October or sometimes November. This year, we actually planted cover crops in the snow. I'm calling it frost seeding. It's a big experiment. several hundred acres of cereal rye, which is...
Do you know how it's going yet?
It looks completely covered today in about this much snow. So it's working. It's working quite effectively. So our whole goal and our whole strategy is to get something to grow in March and April, and to have more residue and more stubble, more biomass available when our soils are extremely vulnerable to heavy spring rains. That's our window, and that's our goal, and the soil health benefits just come along with that. Yeah. We're hoping that there's an impact on Cyst nematode as well. We don't know, but the idea that Ron touched on is the compounding effect of soybean stresses is vital, and Cyst nematodes are something we can do something about. You can manage for them. pH problems, which are quite prevalent, especially in western Minnesota. That's a really tough one to manage. So let's manage the ones that we can do something about, reduce those compounding effects.
Yeah, and you, Ron, both talked about, I mean, there's no silver bullet for this. I mean, that's very apparent. But what is the one management change that you made that you think made the biggest difference? We got ahead of
it before we had a yield problem. And it's managing Cyst nematode is a huge investment in your farm that if you don't do it right, will cost you a lot of soybean yield. So I view it as an investment, and I'm willing to spend a few dollars today on seed treatments or maybe a seed variety that, God forbid, we give up any yield. We don't want to do that by picking a variety, but I don't think we have to do that anymore. So trying to make the investment, certainly the intellectual investment, in managing Cyst nematode as an investment in the future of the farm.
All right, well, we had a lot of flavor from the north, so now let's get some more flavor from the south. And Kip Roberson from Robersonville, North Carolina. You know, I understand soybean cyst nematode, that is not the only nematode pest that you're faced with in the south.
No, soybean cyst nematode it's a problem, but it's not my biggest problem. We have several different kinds where I'm at, and we got root knot, lesion, several others that present problem. Probably my biggest problem is root knot in my area, but we have ways to manage them. I'm like being from the south. I have more opportunity to rotate to different crops than these guys do. I can rotate to cotton and corn and sweet potatoes, and cotton and sweet potatoes has probably been one of my biggest things to rotate to those two crops, because number one with sweet potatoes, we're either putting a nematicide in furrow when we set it out, or we're putting a fumigant down, and that decreases the population of nematodes very drastically when you put a fumigant down.
So what's your story? When did you first realize that soybean cyst nematode was an issue?
Well, about 10 years ago, I got the opportunity to pick up a little bit more farmland, and this gentleman that had rotated soybeans on all 700 acres for the last 25 years, and every now and then he might plant some corn, but it was soybean after soybean after soybean. And of course I went in and I planted some soybeans in a few select fields and started seeing problems. I'd have places out in the middle of the field where it'd be bare, be just a stalk and no bean at all. And we were starting to, well, what's the problem here? So we went out, pulled tests, and come to find out we had soybean cyst nematodes and root knot and several others feeding on the roots of those plants. So it's causing big issues.
Yeah, so what were your next steps after you realized that you didn't have a problem?
Well, like I said, we started pulling tests on every acre that we had. This year I'm pulling tests on every acre again. We tried to rotate those acres that we could, that was nice sandy land, into sweet potatoes where we could fumigate, or rotate into cotton. Cotton's not a host for them, so therefore, and you can also put a seed treatment on the cotton and help reduce the population. So that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, and you've been doing some rotation, but what else have you been doing, considering it was such a huge problem in some of those fields? Like I said,
rotation for cover crops. Anything that you can do, we've done it. We've tried it.
When you look at your crop rotation, I know you rotate with cotton and sweet potatoes, and we know cotton is a non-host crop. What about sweet potatoes? How does that play a role?
Well, sweet potatoes, nematodes love sweet potatoes, but you have several chemicals you could put in furrow. Then I've got fumigants that you can use, and you put a fumigant out 2 or 3 years, you put a real hurting on the population of them.
So after you do some of those crop rotations, how has that impacted the population of soybean cyst nematode in your field?
Well, they've gone down dramatically. I've got in those fields where I was having drastic yield loss with just stalks. I got nice, pretty beans there now.
So there is hope. Even if it's that
Yeah.
far where you see no beans on a stalk, you could still
Yes.
manage it.
Yes, you can manage it. It's very manageable.
And it sounds like, though, you have to actively manage it.
Oh, yeah,
It's
you-
not just a one-time. It's year after year after year.
Yes, yes. You got to spend the money, but you can manage it.
So anything else you want Southern growers to know? What do you want them to know about managing soybean cyst nematode?
Pull test on every acre you got and find out what you got, because I guarantee you they're there.
All right, so as we wrap things up from here, we want some questions. So be thinking about your questions, but I want each of you that you were so willing to share your story from a grower perspective. So from your perspective, why should farmers actively manage soybean cyst nematode in their fields? Ron, I'll start with you.
Because the nematodes are eating your profits. They might be taking a bushel or two a year, or maybe a little more. If they're taking 5 bushel a year, every 10 years you've given away a crop to nematodes. And that's easy to do. It happened to me. Do something. Do more. I think that's a good line. Do more than you have before. The Peking-resistant varieties are so good, I do not lose yield when I plant the Peking varieties. Use the seed treatments. They'll be helpful. Consider the cover crops. Look at your tillage program. Just what can I do to take care of these soybeans?
Pat, what's your take-home message for other farmers?
Similar to Ron's, in that do something. Don't bury your head in the sand.
All right, and Kip?
Same thing. Pull the test, get rid of the pest. Check, make sure you got them, and do something about it, because it's hurting your pocketbook.
Yeah, and from the researcher's perspective, we heard take the test, beat the pest. That's something, Dr. Tylka, you said in the beginning, and that's a slogan that's been around for a while. But can you explain why it is so important for producers to test their fields so they accurately know their SEN numbers?
Well, finally, I get a chance to say something again.
He's done.
I could tell you were about to vote.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for noticing. So I just want to keep it really brief, but I want to interrupt Pat.
Yeah, brief is not your middle name.
Pat's comment is one of my catchphrases, and that is it's easier to keep low numbers low than it is to drive high numbers back down. And we have 2 farmers who've done different approaches. Pat said he really got in front of the yield loss, so he was proactive to keep numbers low. Ron had high numbers, but he, through progressive farming and doing it the right way, drove those numbers back down. But it is easier to keep low numbers low than it is to drive high numbers back down.
Dr. Lawrence, do you want to add to that? Why is it so important to actively test?
Just the basic knowledge of what's there. If you know what's in your soil, you can plan for it. So as long as you put something out, this is preventative. If you select your varieties and arrange your nematicides, you prevent it, then you don't have this problem during the summer. So it's best to prevention, know what's there.
Why do you think it's difficult for some farmers? We keep talking about it, but why do you think it's difficult for some of them to go ahead and test for this? Do they just not know? Do they just not realize? What do you think is the biggest obstacle?
I don't know. What do
They're
you
not
think?
educated.
Okay.
They're not educated on it, so they're not
Just more
they don't
educated.
do it. I mean, my grandfather, God rest his soul, passed away 5 years ago. But we had problems in several fields. We on top of a sand hill. Like I said, the plant would come up, there'd be nothing on it. Oh, it's just sand. Drag it off. And come to find out, after he passed away, I started pulling these tests. Nematodes was the problem.
So just like with Ron, you think
That's
it's
right.
something else, you don't realize that it's soybean cyst nematode. All right, Dr. Tenuta, why is it so important?
Well, it ties in quite nicely with the SCN Coalition messaging, whether you've got low numbers or you've got high numbers, and you have to manage them. And that is part of our messaging there, and put it in perspective in terms of those historic areas, those new areas, and getting that awareness and those management tools out there, whether it's scouting resistant varieties, the PI 88788s, changing your SCN varieties, not overusing the same one, introducing the Peking seed treatments, cover crops, and all of those in there is important, and it comes down to sustainability, as Ron and others have mentioned, and that, and you basically manage SCN instead of it managing you down the road.
Yeah, great advice. All right, well, we have a wealth of knowledge on stage. So if you have any questions, raise your hand. We have a couple microphones floating around. Don't be afraid to ask the first question.
Tyne, while we're waiting for our first question, I have one more comment that spurred a thought here, and I'll probably be brief.
Yep.
One of the things that I truly believe that investing and keeping our numbers low has paid off well for us. It's somewhat of a mixed message when I see marketing messages come out about seed treatments or yield varieties that, well, we didn't see a response to that treatment. Well, to me, that isn't necessarily what I'm after. I'm not after necessarily the response to the treatment. I'm after the long-term goal of keeping my numbers low. And I think sometimes the marketing message might get mixed up for growers.
All right, if you just give us your name and what state you're from.
Chuck White, Iowa. And I know the PI 88788's been our defensive variety, but we're finding resistance, and I think that's going to continue to be a problem. And Peking is a good choice. I've used those. But looking into the future, is there a possibility we can get industry to adopt another type of resistant soybean to work for us? Because I think that's where our real yield potential is going to be. I don't know, the researchers, anybody want to answer that, please?
Go for it. Chuck, you're exactly right. And the good news is through your checkoff investments, there are breakthroughs in new types of resistance. And yesterday we had a short press conference where Melissa Mitchum from University of Missouri spoke and talked about some new wild resistance genes from wild soybean species and some progress being made on stacking genes. And we actually are now to the point where we have a project where we're studying how to best put them in a rotation and what sequence works best to avoid the nematode building up resistance. But there's still one critical gap. It's a huge gap, and that is between the university science and adoption by the seed companies. And at the risk of throwing anybody under the bus, I think the farmers need to let the seed companies know that they want these new innovations in resistance. And it's not going to be easy. It takes human resources, financial resources for a seed company to do this, but that's the vision of the future. And there's been some advances on the university side of research that aren't adopted by the seed industry for perhaps various valid business reasons. But I think until they hear it from a majority of their customers, which are the U.S. and Canadian soybean farmers, they're probably not going to see the value in investing in that new type of resistance.
Okay, question over here.
Don Lund from the state of sobriety in Ontario. Question about cover crops. Been to numerous conferences and farmers talk about cover crops that they're using to reduce. And do you guys have any research to back them up? Because I'm somewhat resistant to what they're saying.
Albert, you speak Canadian, so.
Hey, I do. So we've done some and others as well in terms of cover crops and that, and both. And Pat mentioned he's been growing some cover crops. Which ones do you have on your farm?
So primarily cereal rye is our go-to crop.
Yeah, so cereal rye, those non-host crops, you know, the rye grasses and those. And so one thing when it comes to the cover crop side of things, you know, we've seen some, you know, whether it's sun hemps or some others that are promoted from a cyst nematode management side of things, is to be aware that there are benefits to the cover crops, whether it's the soil health aspects, you know, all of those kinds of things. We also have to be careful, though, too, that we're not introducing maybe some other diseases or other hosts for other nematodes, such as root lesion nematode. We've seen some of those in some of the evaluations we've done with some of our cover crops, that we may be inadvertently increasing another potential pathogen, such as root lesion nematode now, that can also not only affect your soybeans, now can affect your corn, your wheat, your tomatoes and other crops as well. So you go from a risk on the soybean side to now we're introducing or building up a population of a pathogen that can affect you every year. Mm-hmm. So we have to be careful. So there are definitely benefits there, but we have to be cautious as well.
Dr. Tenuta, I think your accent got thicker when you realized you had a Canadian friend in the crowd.
You should hear it.
I heard it more.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. Jim Gill, I work in southern Minnesota. One of the issues, I think, we're kind of mixing nematodes here. You know, this is soybean cyst nematode, but we've heard lesion, we've heard root knot, and all those behave differently. And all of them are different sensitivity to rotation. because I think what's unique about soybean cyst is the fact that it forms a cyst. And the cyst, you can't drive a cyst down until it hatches. So could somebody address that point about lesion and root knot, how they behave relative to rotation? Because the farmer, Pat, you made the comment about having peas in your rotation, and peas stimulate the hatching of the cyst, if I'm not mistaken. Whereas in other rotations, you're talking about sweet potato and the chemicals you're using. It's a different economic system. Maybe you can afford to do more in those crops chemically than we can in soybean rotations in the Midwest. So can somebody please address that issue about life cycle, about the different nematodes and how they exist?
Okay.
You go first. You.
Okay. For the root knot nematode, we have actually noticed that if we switch from cotton to corn to soybean, the root knot, it adjusts to its host crop. So even though all three of those are susceptible to our root knot, the incognita, the population will get larger and larger. If I grow 3 years of cotton, I go from 1,000 to 8,000 in my pinus soil. But if I switch from cotton to soybean, it'll go from 1,000 to only 2,000. So even though we switch crops and they are susceptible and host, changing that food source keeps that population lower than if we grow the same crop over and over and over. So for our root knots, that works well.
Right, but I'm just saying soybean cyst doesn't behave that way.
No.
It goes down to a certain level and it stays there.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It does.
Dr. Tenuta, Dr. Tylka, any of you
Yeah.
want to address that?
Well, and then the other side of that in terms of if you're talking about introducing potential hosts into that system in the rotation side. So in the northern side, dry beans or peas in the rotation, those are potential hosts as well. So remember, when you're managing that or building your rotation, that you're substituting a host crop for a host crop, right? So don't start putting soybeans, dry beans together, and you're building those populations for sure. Okay?
Well, I think what I heard Jim asking about is summarized by saying that when things kind of slip up and get out of control with soybean cyst nematode, it might take a little longer to get them back under control because of its long-term survival compared to a root knot or a root lesion or another nematode like that, because as far as we can tell, 20, 30, 40, 50% of the eggs in soybean cyst nematode cyst may not hatch the next year or the year after. So it's a little harder to right the ship, if you will, with soybean cyst perhaps than the other nematodes that don't have such a good survival structure. And that reminds me of a very wise man who once said it's easier to keep low numbers low than it is to drive high numbers down.
Yes, very wise. Okay, question in the back.
Question for the growers, Bob from Ontario. I'm curious what seed treatments you're using, and are you seeing any differences between things like Chloriva, Illevo, or if you've maybe tried Nemastrike at all?
So convenience means a lot. I'm a production seed grower for Syngenta, and they make it very easy for me to use Chloriva, and so quite a few of my acres get that because I'm a production grower for a Syngenta seed plant. I have no research, no on-farm trials testing different seed treatments from a nematode response standpoint.
I'm also a production seed grower, and my company uses Illevo. But I want to repeat the purpose of the seed treatments is to take good care of the soybean seed and the soybean plant. It's not a primary function of the seed to control seed treatment to control the nematodes. So I'd be a little surprised if there was a significant difference with nematodes. It's about the plant health.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, Don Remley from Ontario. Ron, I think you said you may have misunderstood. You sprayed something over top?
Ron, did you spray something over the top?
Nematodes?
No, I haven't sprayed anything for nematodes.
Has anybody sprayed anything for nematodes?
Yes. In the South, we can.
What?
We use Vidate. It's actually, but it's labeled on cotton. I don't believe it's labeled on soybean.
So not an option for our northern
A
counterparts?
northern guy.
Okay.
It is on the southern, but not northern.
Can she
Sorry.
repeat what it was she sprayed?
Can you say it again?
Vidate, CLV. Vidate CLV is what we used. And I know it's generic now, so it has other names. because it has gone generic. Do you know other?
I don't know what the generic is.
Yeah.
Dr. Tylka, is there anything you can spray over the top, or?
No, not that we've looked at or not that I'm aware of. Nope.
No, we've looked at some through our North Central Soybean Research Program, Grain Farmers of Ontario ones with some foliar application. We haven't seen any impact on nematode control.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Question.
Yes.
I know in the north we do corn on corn as a part of that tactic, and so if we do corn on corn for a few years, do I have to be concerned about any corn nematodes that would cross reference into the soybean situation?
And where is he?
Where are you exactly?
Well, it'd be Iowa, Minnesota.
Okay, you guys.
You want to go for that one?
Yeah.
He said the north, but I think Dr. Tylka was passing the buck.
Okay.
Yeah, I know we have corn nematodes. So.
My contract prohibits me from talking about nematodes on corn. Boy, that's a much less tidy situation with nematodes on corn. I think the benefits you would reap from growing a couple years of corn for your SCN situation would far offset any buildup of corn nematodes that would happen. The population dynamics of nematodes on corn aren't very well understood, and it's just not a matter of multiple years of corn like it is with soybean cyst nematode and SCN. So weather plays a huge part, soil conditions. So you might not experience what you would expect to be a buildup of corn nematodes through a couple years of corn. It breaks my heart, though, that you would do that and not grow soybeans every other year, but I would understand for that. I don't think they're similar situations, though.
Now, we had, when we first had soybean cyst nematode, we had a lot of continuous corn put in because of the yield losses associated with soybeans. And in some cases, we had 7-8 years of continuous corn, and when we went in and the grower planted his soybeans in there, they were devastated. We had numbers as high as 80,000 eggs in those fields after 7 or 8 years. And in many cases, you get that benefit of corn, and in most cases, up to that second year. After that, we don't really see that benefit on the cyst nematode side. There has been some surveys done both in the Midwest and into Ontario where we're starting to see, some of the root lesion nematode numbers increasing as well on corn. But, as Greg mentioned, we don't have a good idea on the hybrids, tolerances, resistance, and all that yet.
Okay, do you have another question? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Just one more follow-up.
Yeah.
Can you speak to some of the weedy hosts?
Some of the weedy hosts of soybean cyst nematode. Some of the weeds that are hosts.
Waterham, Palmer, ragweed.
No. None, those aren't hosts. The common annual weeds that occur in season have all been studied, and there are none that have been discovered to be hosts. But when you get into the realm of winter annual weeds, the henbit, dead nettle, purple dead nettle, pennycress is another one. Those can be actually quite good hosts for SCN, as shown by greenhouse studies. But the thing to remember with those is there was great reproduction on those weeds in the greenhouse because the temperatures were appropriate, but temperature plays a huge factor. So once soil temperatures get below about 50 degrees, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, sorry, my Canadian friends, I don't know the centigrade equivalent, there are stages of SCN that stop developing. So you can't have reproduction on winter annual weeds if the soil is too cool. So there's a very large temperature component to SCN reproducing on winter annual weeds.
All right, last question. Time for one more, all the way in the back.
Do you have guidelines or recommendations for soil testing for nematodes? Do you test entire fields by the acre, zones, known problem areas? I'm from Indiana, and I assume it's that way everywhere, but nematode testing is $25 to $100 a pop. How do you actually test for them? What are the guidelines for doing it?
Dr. Tylka, you want to start first, and I'll get each of your input?
Well, I understand the question and feel your frustration. It's a bit, I'll do what my children do, and that's often answer a question by asking a question. And it really, my question to you would be, what are you trying to accomplish? But there's different approaches to sampling for different intents. And since we're running out of time, the best answer can be found on the SCN Coalition's website, which is thescncoalition.com. And there are fact sheets that talk about different sampling strategies. If you're looking for SCN and you've never found it before, if you're looking to kind of keep a feel on what the numbers are doing over time and so forth. And so, again, that website, thescncoalition.com, there'll be fact sheets that can help you out. Or if you want to reach out to me personally by an email or something, I can send you that information as well. Yep.
Okay, to wrap us up, quick, rapid fire, go down the line. What's the one thing you want everyone to know to take home from Commodity Classic this year about soybean cyst nematode? Greg, real quick.
I pass. I'll give my time to Ron.
You probably have
We're
them,
not
and
in
they can be
Congress.
managed.
Okay. Good.
Sample, whether it's one sample for 100 acres or if you can break it up into 425s, do it.
Pat?
Manage it. Don't forget about it.
I'll agree, sample. You need to know what's there.
Kip?
Manage and sample. That's all you can do.
All right, let's give our roundtable discussion here, our panelists, a round of applause. And don't forget, Dr. Tylka mentioned it, but the scncoalition.com. You can go there for more information. We also have a booth, 1256 in there. You can come check out the SCN Coalition's booth. And a big thanks again to our corporate sponsors, BASF, Bayer, Syngenta Farm Journal, also supported by growers' checkoff organizations such as North Central Soybean Research Program, United Soybean Board, and several state soybean promotion boards. So thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of Commodity Classic 2019.